Hey everyone, I'm Russell Rowland, the host of The Song of Roland, and I'm going to spend this episode talking about the work of Rob Reiner. I obviously have no personal connection to him, so I'm not going to really talk about what happened, although obviously that's just a horrible tragedy. But the thing I've been thinking about since that happened is just how present he's been in our culture for a really long time. I mean, All in the Family came out in 1971. So, yeah, for 55 years or so, he's been a steady presence in American culture. And, it's one of the sad things about losing someone like that is that you tend to look back and realize that you kind of took him for granted. He didn't put out a lot of movies. He seemed like a director who picked and chose his projects very carefully and chose stuff that was interesting to him, which I admire. Maybe part of it was that he didn't really have to work steadily. Who knows? But the remarkable thing about Reiner's legacy is that for like a 10-year period between 84 and 94, he put out what I would argue are the best romantic comedy, one of the best suspense thrillers ever made, one of the best courtroom dramas ever made, probably the best mockumentary ever made, and the best fantasy, whimsical fairy tale, Princess Bride, which is in a category of its own, and it's the best of whatever that category is, whatever you want to call it. It's a movie that is among the favorites of so many people. So I'm going to go through and name my personal favorite top 10 projects that Rob Reiner worked on. I'm going to go from 10 to 1. Enjoy. I hope this will inspire some of you to go back and rewatch some of his films, which I've been doing since the tragic death of Rob Reiner. So for number 10, I'm going to start with The American President. This film was made in 95, so it was kind of toward the end of Reiner's really hot streak. It's a film that features Michael Douglas as the President of the United States. He's a widower. It's one of those kind of slick political dramas. In fact, it was written by Aaron Sorkin, who would soon after this go on to introduce the West Wing, which pretty much became the standard bearer for political TV. So it's got Sorkin's stamp on it way more than Reiner. But it's a good example of how Rob Reiner was able to adapt to whatever themes or subject matter he was working on and get the best out of his actors and his crew. I mean, it's such a tight movie. It's kind of quaint in a way when you look at the storyline. Michael Douglas falls in love with Annette Bening, who plays a environmentalist. She's a lobbyist, actually.
Mr. President, I don't know what to say. I'm speechless.
All evidence to the contrary.
And there's a big scandal about it. And so this is what makes it kind of quaint compared to what's going on today, because his poll numbers start to drop just because he's dating this woman.
Never mind that she is the hired gun of an ultra-liberal political action committee.
Much of the plot revolves around all of his staff like scrambling around trying to figure out how to fix these poll numbers that are steadily dropping. And of course, he refuses to give up dating this woman he's in love with.
59% of the country has begun to question your family values.
This poll doesn't talk about my presidency. This poll talks about my life.
I have come to realize that I'm not a big fan of the type of films and TV that have like the snappy banter where everyone is just on their game all the time. It doesn't feel very realistic to me. So this movie kind of falls into that category. So it's not one of my favorites, but it does stand up pretty well as a solid piece of filmmaking, even if it's a little dated as far as the subject matter. Number 9, A Few Good Men. Obviously, a lot of people would rank this much higher than I do. I'm not a big fan of military films that even glorify the military a little bit, but So I had some trouble with this, even though it does focus on some of the corruption that can happen within the military. Of course, the highlight of this film is the performance by Jack Nicholson, who's just amazing as this general who gets up on the stand and gives a bravura performance.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
It is a great cast overall. And, once again, Reiner gets the most out of these people. I would say that a lot of these people gave some of their best performances ever in this film. Demi Moore, Tom Cruise, Kevin Bacon, Kevin Pollak is in it. So yeah, it's just got a great cast. And, once again, tight, like his ability to very economically put a story forward and just keep the viewer engaged was just very consistently good. The next one is probably one not a lot of people have seen. It's a documentary that came out just a couple of years ago called Albert Brooks, Defend My Life. So one of the most interesting things about Reiner's personal story is that he and Albert Brooks were best friends in high school, when Albert Brooks was still known by his real name, which is Albert Einstein, which is pretty funny in and of itself. But Albert Brooks was, I'm sure most of you know, he's made some amazing comedies that are sort of like he's a little just enough off the beaten path that a lot of people maybe don't get it. But his films are, to me, hilarious. Defending Your Life is one of the best. Finding America is an incredible film. And he's just a funny guy overall. So, in fact, one of my favorite facts that came out from this documentary is that Carl Reiner, so Rob's dad, for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure there's not very many of you, Carl Reiner was a legend in the comedy world. He created the Dick Van Dyke Show. He was a writer for Sid Caesar's Show of Shows. And of course, he collaborated a lot with Mel Brooks. Those two were a powerhouse pair. So Carl Reiner worked with some of the best in the business. And he said that Albert Brooks was the funniest man he ever met. So that tells you a lot about how much Albert Brooks is respected sort of within the community. So this film is basically just Rob Reiner and Albert Brooks talking about Albert Brooks's career. And it's a beautiful conversation between two old friends. Albert Brooks talks very openly about how hard it's been for him to get his films made because he's just so unique, just not quite what Hollywood would be looking for most of the time. But, every single one of his films is just so, they're just all so good. So it was interesting to hear these two old friends talk about not just their successes, but some of the difficulties that faced Albert Brooks throughout his career and throughout his life. It's a wonderfully touching and personal film. So the next on the list is All in the Family. And how can you not have a list of Rob Reiner without All in the Family? So he was only 24 when he was cast for this role. And of course, he played Archie Bunker's son-in-law, married to Sally Struthers. And, I think as much as Carol O'Connor gets as much credit as most of the credit for the success of that show, as he should, he was just brilliant in that show. I think it's pretty obvious that his character would not have been as effective if he didn't have a foil, if he didn't have someone there who was constantly challenging him and constantly getting under his skin. I mean, nobody provoked Archie Bunker more than Michael Stivic, Meathead. And Reiner was just great in this show.
Hey, what kind of a dirty crack is that?
What did I say, Mike?
You insulted my husband!
Well, I hope not.
For such a young guy, he just projected such confidence and passion for the issues that he was interested in. And of course, while Archie Bunker was conservative and not very educated and not very interested in becoming educated. Michael Stivic was very liberal and progressive, and so they clashed often. But there's also this sort of beautiful underlying affection between the two and respect. I mean, even when they're arguing, you kind of know that they have this bond that they can't get escape from. And it also helps that Michael and his wife live with Archie and Edith. So it's just an ongoing source of tension and comic relief in this epic classic TV show. And of course, that put him on the map. The next thing on my list is another acting performance. And, I think Reiner was also choosy in what he did for performances as far as his acting career. He was in a lot of stuff, but he usually had small supporting parts. He wasn't a lead guy, and maybe he didn't have any desire to. He was probably more interested in being the director than in being a lead actor. But he was in a lot of films that you might not remember. He was in Primary Colors, Postcards from the Edge. He was in The Jerk. He was in Sleepless in Seattle. A lot of stuff. But my favorite performance that he ever gave was in Bullets Over Broadway, which is a Woody Allen film that came out in 94. And this is one of my favorite Woody Allen films that's not as well known as a lot of the other ones. John Cusack is in it. He sort of plays Woody Allen. He's got the same sort of neurotic tics that Woody Allen usually has. But Rob Reiner plays this guy who's a writer. He's a writer, but he's one of these writers who sits in a coffee shop all day and talks about being a writer. And he hasn't produced anything for years. So even the people that are close to him talk to him behind his back, talk about him behind his back as being, kind of a blowhard. But he's also, as a guy who was a good writer at one time, he's also smart and interesting.
You gotta do what you gotta do.
Reiner is just fabulous in this role of this guy who's just sort of so full of himself. His name is Sheldon Flender too, which is great. It's just a fabulous name for a blowhard wannabe writer. So to me, that's his finest comedy performance in films. Next on the list at number 5 is Misery. Several of Reiner's movies were adapted from Stephen King. This was one of them. And of course, this was Kathy Bates's big breakthrough role. She's just amazing as Annie Wilkins, this woman who is this suspense writer's biggest fan. Paul Sheldon is played by James Caan. And James Caan, I think, was an underrated actor. He did a lot of films where he had roles that were a little off of his tough guy persona that he usually played, like in The Godfather. He was just great in this film. So Annie Wilkins accidentally comes across Paul Sheldon. He had a car accident, and she drags him off to her cabin in the middle of nowhere and ties him up and decides to use this opportunity to express her displeasure in some of the choices that he's made about his books, and one book in particular. So, it's a great suspense. This is, I talked earlier about one of the great suspense movies ever. To me, this ranks right up there as far as not the big, broad suspense films that have become way too prominent. It's more of a, psychological thriller, and these two working together are just terrific. Next is another Stephen King adaptation, Stand By Me. And this was one of Reiner's first films. Okay, so before I get to that, I'm going to talk about one of his earlier films, because he's kind of known for his directorial debut was, I think, The Sure Thing. And I tried to watch that the other night. I don't think I had ever seen it. And, it's one of these movies that does not hold up well. John Cusack plays this college kid who's trying to get laid, basically. And, that storyline has not aged well with the Me Too movement, and for good reason. I think it's great that this movie would probably not get made today. So thankfully, Reiner moved on from that kind of thing to Stand By Me, which is just a terrific coming of age film. I think probably working with kids is one of the biggest challenges for any director, but for him to be able to have this cast of young kids that play the main cluster of characters in this film, and most of the film is the kids. I mean, there's hardly any adult presence in this film. So for one thing, writing dialogue for kids is tough. And I know Reiner didn't write the dialogue, but whoever wrote the script did an incredible job of making these kids feel like they're the real deal. And of course, the cast was a huge part of what made this film successful. And River Phoenix, it's such a shame that his life ended so young because every movie he made, he just showed such depth and maturity. I mean, he plays sort of the leader of this group of four young guys. And of course, the plot, as you probably remember, is that they hear there's this dead body of one of their classmates, actually, who's laying out in the middle of this field somewhere after being hit by a train. So they come up with this plan to go try and find the body. And it's just these four dopey kids, going off on this adventure. And one of the things that makes it really powerful is that the issues that each of these kids are dealing with at home come up a lot. And they've all got their own struggles. One of them has a dad who's an alcoholic and abusive. The River Phoenix character is one of these kids who comes from a family that's looked down upon by everyone else. So he's kind of an underdog, but he's also obviously one of the smartest kids in the school. And the way River Phoenix, there's a scene where he talks about that particular aspect of his life with the main character, who's played by Will Wheaton, and he does an incredible job too as the main character. But River Phoenix talks about being looked down upon and the way people treat him and his family, and he breaks down and cries, and it's just some incredible acting for a kid that age. So there's a lot of moments like that. I think it says a lot about the casting, that three of these actors went on to do great stuff after this film. Will Wheaton has done several movies since then, become more of a writer than an actor. Jerry O'Donnell is kind of the most surprising one. He plays the fat, sort of dumpy kid in this film, and he turned out to be this kind of hunky guy who's also good at comedy, and he's had just a good, solid career. Corey Feldman made a lot of good films when he was a kid, but he's kind of tried to become the Michael Jackson of his era, and he's not good. He should have stuck to acting. The main thing that comes out of this film is how good Reiner was with kids, how good he was at crafting a storyline that just never stops being interesting and keeps moving right along. It's just a perfectly crafted film about kids. And there's also kind of I like the way it ended. I think there was two ways it could have gone, and I don't want to give anything away, but he didn't go for the easy solution there. He took a different route, and that's one of the things that always made his films interesting to me. Third is When Harry Met Sally, and of course, this is considered by a lot of people to be the best romantic comedy ever made. Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan are just terrific as these two friends who spend most of the film talking about how they don't want to be in a relationship together, and then eventually decide to give it a try. So much of the success of this film has to do with the chemistry between those two, and they're absolutely fabulous together. But there's also another thing that makes it great is they have the classic friends of the couple, and Bruno Kirby and Carrie Fisher are absolutely fabulous as those two people. So between those four characters, you've got just a lot of brilliant comedic moments, but also, it's one of those romantic comedies. And of course, what makes a romantic comedy work, I think, for me anyway, is when it's not always funny, but that there's a few moments of genuine pathos and feeling between the characters. And there's plenty of that in this film. And then, of course, it has the classic scene where Meg Ryan fakes the orgasm in the deli.
Oh, God. Oh.
I'll have what she's having.
As you probably know, that was Rob Reiner's mother who delivered that classic line. And actually, I just read recently that Billy Crystal was the one that came up with that. It's interesting that Reiner seemed to like to work with certain people over and over again. So yeah, there's a lot of films that he made with John Cusack. There's a lot of films he made with Billy Crystal. There's a couple that he made with Steve Martin. He seemed to be one of these guys who was able to work with the people he liked. So that really shows. Number 2, made in 1984, one of his first directorial projects was This Is Spinal Tap. And this film just broke all kinds of barriers as far as how filmmakers make these fake documentaries. Reiner stars as the director himself, Marty DeBurgi. He pretends to be this guy who's making a documentary about this heavy metal band. And there's been so much written about how this film was made and how the main characters all pretty much improvised most of the film. What makes it work is that he was working with 3 of the most brilliant comedic minds of that time period. So you got Michael McKean, who, got his big break with Laverne and Shirley. Then Christopher Guest, who has gone on to become pretty much the master of the mockumentary. After making this film, he obviously was inspired by this and has gone on to make just fabulous Waiting for Guffman, Best in Show. There's at least 4 or 5 mockumentaries that he's made, and every single one of them is just so much fun. The third guy is Harry Shearer, who's been one of the main voices for The Simpsons. Occasionally he'll pop up in a movie. The best part of this film is that Reiner comes across just so perfectly as this, sincere fan of this band, which must have been hard. I mean, I'm sure there's probably a lot of outtakes where he couldn't keep from laughing, but he just keeps it straight throughout. And, the fact that they're all improvising, it must, I don't know how he kept a straight face.
Very delicate.
It's a bit of a departure from the kind of thing you normally play. What do you call this?
Well, this piece is called Lick My Love Pump.
So his performance is part of what makes this film great, but it's mostly the 3 guys, the musicians. And it helped that all 3 of these guys are actually talented musicians, so they played the music too. I actually saw the sequel that just came out earlier this year, and I was not expecting much. I thought, it's been 40 years since this movie came out. There's no way they're going to be able to recapture the magic. But you know what? It was surprisingly good. I was pleasantly surprised. So give it a shot. It's fun, and it has some great cameos with Paul McCartney and Elton John and a few other people. And of course, the number 1, there's no other choice in my book than Princess Bride. This was just such a unique film, and what kind of makes it surprising as far as being such a huge success for all these years is that it was mostly made up of a cast of people who were not that well known at the time. Cary Elwes, I don't think probably anybody knew who he was before he got the role as Wesley, the stable boy who falls in love with the Princess Bride. And Robin Wright, she was probably the best known of the cast members. Well, Billy Crystal, obviously. So Wesley falls in love with this princess. She's promised to this prince to become his wife. A lot of drama ensues. And of course, the supporting cast in this film is just incredible. Mandy Patinkin is brilliant as the guy who's trying to avenge his father's death, and he keeps delivering the classic line about prepare to die. Wallace Shawn, who was probably not that well known when this came out either. Just that one simple inconceivable becomes another classic. Andre the Giant is amazing in this film. He shows surprising comic timing in his role. And then Billy Crystal and Carol Kane as these two like goblins who people go to try to revive Wesley when he's knocked unconscious at one point. And even Peter Cook, who was Dudley Moore's partner in TV way back in the day, is fabulous as the priest who's supposed to marry the princess to her prince that she's not happy about marrying. Peter Cook's got this incredible lisp. Everything about this film is just charming and fun and heartwarming. It's just a beautiful film that stands up over time. I mean, it's one of those movies you can watch over and over again. So, just to sum up, what an incredible body of work this man left behind. And it makes me sad that, first of all, this had to happen for a lot of us to notice. Also, and I just heard this, I think it was yesterday, I just heard somebody talking about how frustrating it had become for Reiner to try to get funding for his movies in the later years. And of course, that's a common story in Hollywood, even for some of the most successful filmmakers ever. But it's a shame. I mean, he should have been one of these guys who was able to do whatever he wanted to do. He was only nominated for an Oscar once for Best Picture for A Few Good Men, which is also kind of a criminal. I mean, how could some of these other films not be nominated for Best Film? And he was never nominated for Best Director, which is definitely a crime. The best way to remember him is to go back and fully absorb yourself in what he brought to the world. Thank you for joining me for this episode of The Song of Roland. Thanks a lot for joining me for this episode of The Song of Roland, a podcast about American culture. I want to thank Stephen Gillis of Dzonk Books for sponsoring this podcast, and I want to thank Tiffany Hauk for her wonderful production skills, and I would like to thank my son Fletcher for his musical contributions. Join me again next time for another episode of The Song of Roland.